5,000 years ago, Europe was a continent of peace, prosperity, and stone. If you were to walk across the landscape of prehistoric Britain, France, or Germany, you would see thriving agricultural communities. These were the early European farmers. They were the descendants of people who had migrated from the Middle East thousands of years earlier, bringing the revolutionary technology of agriculture with them. They cultivated wheat, raised livestock, and built stable, settled villages. They were also master architects. These were the people who dragged massive stones across the countryside to build Stonehenge in England and the incredible passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland. They were looking up at the stars, mapping the solstices, and burying their dead with reverence. They seemed invincible, a civilization at the peak of its power. But then, suddenly, they vanished. Around 4,500 years ago, the people who built Stonehenge completely disappeared from the genetic record of Britain. Not their buildings, not their tools, but their blood. Within a span of just a few hundred years, up to 90% of the local population in Britain was entirely wiped out and replaced by strangers. For decades, archaeologists debated what happened. Was it a climate disaster? A cultural shift? Did they simply change their pottery styles and burial habits? But DNA does not lie. When modern geneticists extracted DNA from the ancient bones of those farmers and compared it to skeletons from just a few centuries later, the truth was horrifying. This was not a peaceful cultural exchange. This was a demographic apocalypse. It was the most brutal, rapid, and complete genetic takeover in human history. A mysterious group of warriors had arrived from the east. They rode animals no one had ever tamed, wielded weapons of bronze, and brought with them an invisible killer that would decimate the ancient world. Today, we are tracking down the ghost riders of the steppe. We are going to uncover the dark secret of the Yamnaya warlords and how their violent conquest rewrote the DNA, the culture, and the very languages of the modern world. Prepare yourself. You are watching Lost Origins. The genetic earthquake. To understand the sheer scale of this ancient apocalypse, we have to look at the genetic map of Europe before the invasion. Before the Bronze Age, the European gene pool was primarily made up of two distinct groups. First, there were the Western hunter-gatherers, the ancient, dark-skinned, blue-eyed survivors of the Ice Age. Second, there were the early European farmers, who had lighter skin, dark eyes, and a deeply settled agrarian lifestyle. Over thousands of years, these two groups slowly mixed, creating a stable, flourishing Neolithic society. But when scientists at Harvard University and the Max Planck Institute began sequencing ancient DNA from European graves dating to around 2,500 BC, they hit a genetic earthquake. Suddenly, a massive influx of entirely new DNA appeared out of nowhere. It was a genetic profile that had never been seen in Western Europe before. And it didn't just trickle in, it flooded the continent. In Iberia, modern-day Spain and Portugal, the arrival of this new DNA was catastrophic. The genetic record shows that while some local women survived and passed on their genes, almost 100% of the local male Y chromosomes were completely wiped out and replaced. Let that sink in. Almost every single local man in Iberia was either killed, driven away, or prevented from reproducing. The new arrivals took their land, took their resources, and took their women. In Britain, the replacement was even more extreme. Within a few generations of the strangers arriving, the DNA of the people who built Stonehenge dropped to less than 10%. The island was completely repopulated. Who were these conquerors? Where did they come from? And how did they manage to annihilate established, heavily populated farming civilizations? To find the answer, geneticists had to look east, far beyond the forests of Europe, to a massive, unforgiving ocean of grass, the ghost riders of the steppe. North of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, Spanning across modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia lies the Pontic-Caspian steppe. It is a harsh, extreme environment, freezing in the winter, baking in the summer, and offering very little shelter. 5,000 years ago, you could not farm here. The soil and climate would not allow it. To survive the steppe, you had to be tough, mobile, and utterly ruthless. This was the home of the Yamnaya. The Yamnaya were a culture of nomadic pastoralists. They did not build cities. They did not build stone temples. They lived in tents, constantly moving their massive herds of cattle and sheep across the endless grasslands. Genetically, the Yamnaya were massive. Skeletal evidence suggests they were significantly taller and more muscular than the farmers of Western Europe. They had light skin, brown eyes, and dark hair, and culturally, they were deeply patriarchal and deeply violent. When archaeologists dig up Yamnaya graves, known as kurgans, which are large burial mounds, they don't find peaceful farmers. They find warriors. The men are almost always buried with heavy stone maces, bronze daggers, and axes. Their skeletons show massive physical trauma: broken skulls, shattered ribs, parrying fractures on their arms. These were men who lived and died by violence. For a long time, the Yamnaya were trapped on the steppe. They could not move deep into the European forests because they relied on their grazing herds. But then, in a very short period of time, they acquired a set of technological and biological superweapons that transformed them from scattered nomads into an unstoppable conquering force: the weapons of mass replacement. How does a group of wandering herders conquer a continent of settled, fortified farmers? The Yamnaya's first superweapon was mobility. They were among the very first humans to domesticate the horse. While they may not have been riding into battle like medieval knights just yet, they used horses to manage vast herds of livestock over enormous distances. But the real game changer was a brand new invention that had just reached the steppe: the wheel. The Yamnaya built heavy, solid-wheeled wooden wagons pulled by oxen. This sounds simple to us today, but 5,000 years ago, it was the equivalent of inventing the spaceship. The wagon meant they no longer had to live near rivers or lakes. They could load their tents, their women, their children, and their supplies onto wheels and move their entire society anywhere they wanted. They became the world's first mobile civilization. Their second superweapon was biological. It was hidden in their blood. The early European farmers could not digest milk after childhood. They made cheese and yogurt to reduce the lactose, but drinking raw milk would make them violently ill. The Yamnaya, however, had developed a genetic mutation for lactase persistence. They could drink raw cow and horse milk as adults. This gave them a mobile, renewable source of high-calorie hydration and nutrition. While the farmers were tied to their crop cycles and vulnerable to droughts, the Yamnaya carried their food and water supply with them in the form of their herds. But their final superweapon was by far the most terrifying. When scientists analyzed the teeth of ancient Yamnaya skeletons, they found traces of a microscopic pathogen. It was an early ancestral strain of Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes the Bubonic Plague. This discovery completely rewrote the theory of the conquest. Did the Yamnaya win through sheer military force, or did they inadvertently launch the first biological war in human history? Because the Yamnaya lived in close proximity to their animals on the open steppe, they likely developed a natural immunity or tolerance to this early plague. But the early European farmers, living in dense, crowded, unsanitary villages, had no immunity whatsoever. It is highly probable that before the Yamnaya warriors even swung a bronze axe, the plague swept through the farming communities of Europe, carried by traders and scouts. The diseases would have decimated the local populations, turning thriving villages into ghost towns. When the Yamnaya finally rolled in on their wagons, they didn't find a strong, organized resistance. They found a post-apocalyptic wasteland, a shattered civilization ripe for the taking, the patriarchal takeover. What followed was a brutal genetic bottleneck. The genetic evidence paints a very dark picture of human nature. When the Yamnaya moved into Europe, they did not integrate peacefully. The DNA of modern Europeans shows a massive bias towards Yamnaya male lineages. This means that a relatively small number of Yamnaya men had children with a very large number of local European women. The local European men were almost entirely excluded from the gene pool. This was a patriarchal takeover. The Yamnaya operated in violent, male-dominated war bands. They expanded into new territories, eliminated the male competition, and took the women for themselves. It was a winner-takes-all scenario on a continental scale. This aggressive, expansionist culture didn't just move west into Europe. Another branch of the same steppe ancestry moved east, crossing the mountains into the Indian subcontinent. They called themselves the Aryans, a word that simply meant the noble ones in their ancient tongue. They brought their chariots, their horses, and their DNA deep into Asia, displacing and mixing with the ancient Indus Valley civilizations. From the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Indian Ocean in the east, the descendants of the steppe nomads had conquered the known world. The words we speak, but the Yamnaya didn't just leave their blood behind. They left something even more enduring. They left their voices. If you speak English, Spanish, Russian, Greek, or even Hindi, you are speaking a language that traces its roots directly back to the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Linguists have spent centuries reconstructing a hypothetical ancient language called Proto-Indo-European. They noticed that words for fundamental concepts like mother, brother, horse, and wheel sounded suspiciously similar across dozens of different languages spanning from Ireland to India. For a long time, no one knew exactly who spoke this original mother tongue, but the DNA revolution provided the final, undeniable proof. The spread of the Indo-European languages perfectly matches the genetic expansion of the Yamnaya. When they conquered Europe and Asia, they eradicated not just the local men, but the local languages. The languages of the early European farmers went completely extinct, save for a few isolated pockets, like the Basque language in modern-day Spain. Every time you say the word water, or night, or star, you are echoing the exact same sounds made by violent nomads riding across the Russian grasslands 5,000 years ago. They forced the world to speak their tongue, and we are still speaking it today. The echoes of the steppe. The story of the Yamnaya shatters the myth of genetic purity. Today, if you take a DNA test and it says you are 100% European, that simply means you are a specific mixture of 3 ancient ghosts. You carry the DNA of the blue-eyed hunter-gatherers who survived the Ice Age. You carry the DNA of the dark-eyed farmers who built Stonehenge. And, inevitably, you carry the DNA of the violent, milk-drinking warlords from the eastern steppes. History is not a peaceful progression of ideas. It is written in blood, survival, and replacement. We are the descendants of the conquered, but we are also the descendants of the conquerors. The early European farmers built monuments of stone that have lasted for 5 millennia. But the Yamnaya didn't need to build monuments. Their monument is you. Their legacy is in your immune system, your ability to drink milk, the shape of your face, and the words coming out of your mouth. They were the ancient warlords who wiped out early Europe. And in doing so, they created the modern world. What do you think about the Yamnaya? Is it disturbing to know that modern civilizations were built on such a brutal genetic takeover? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you want to dive deeper into the dark secrets hidden in our blood, make sure to check out our documentary on the impossible DNA found hidden in the Amazon. I'm Thomas, and this is Lost Origins. Never stop digging for the truth.